problems that they were having. If they weren't having problems, then he didn't write about them in his letters. What does Paul say? Paul tells us a number of important things about the historical Jesus based on what he knew. He indicates that Jesus was actually born physically, that he had a woman as his mother, that he came from the line of King David, that he was born a Jew, that he was a Jewish Messiah, that he had brothers. One of them was named James. He preached to other Jews. He had 12 disciples. One of them was Peter, whom Paul knew. Jesus was a teacher. Paul explicitly cites several of Jesus' teachings. Jesus had a Last Supper with his disciples. Jesus was crucified by the ruling authorities at the instigation of the Jewish authorities. Paul tells us these things. I want to focus on 2 points in particular that Paul states about Jesus. The first is one that is central to many of the debates about mythicism. It comes in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, where Paul says that 3 years after his conversion, so this would be, by my chronology, about the year 35 or 36, the Common Era, he says, after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. I remained with him for 15 days. Cephas is Peter, Jesus' closest disciple. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. The brother of the Lord. Paul knows Jesus' brother, and he knows Jesus' closest disciple, Cephas. The word brother in the New Testament always means one of 2 things. A brother means a blood relative who's born to the same mother. That's one of the things it means. In other words, it means what brother means. The second thing it means is it sometimes often refers to members of the same believing community who stand in close solidarity. And so you can talk about your brothers, Jewish brothers, Christian brothers, depending on what your faith commitments are. Those are the 2 things that brother means in unambiguous cases in the New Testament. If anyone wants to claim that the word brother means something else, in any context, they're free to do that, but they need to have clear and compelling reasons for thinking so, other than the fact that they don't want to think that the word means what it means. In Paul's case, when he says that James was the brother of Jesus, what does he mean? He cannot mean simply that he was somebody who stood in close solidarity with Jesus, because he's contrasting James with Cephas. He's explaining that he met with Cephas and with the brother of the Lord, James. In other words, Cephas is not the brother of the Lord. You get the same phenomenon in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, where Paul says that other people are allowed to take their wives with them, and so he too should be allowed to do so. Paul should be allowed to do so because other people take wives with them on their missions. And he says that Cephas doesn't, Apollos doesn't, Paul himself doesn't, but the brothers of the Lord do. That means that none of the others are the brothers of the Lord. Paul knew James. He spent weeks with James. He knew Peter, Jesus' closest disciple. If Jesus didn't exist, then surely his best friend and his brother would know about it. They didn't know about it because he did exist. Second point about Paul has to tell us, Paul understands that Jesus was the crucified Messiah. This is the important point. Paul understands Jesus as the crucified Messiah. 2 things to say about that. First, if a first century Jew talked about someone who was crucified, what do they have in mind? Romans crucified people all the time. When people talked about crucified people, what did they mean? You can read any ancient source. Read Josephus if you want to. Read any ancient source. What do people mean when they talk about someone who's crucified? They talk about the same thing time after time after time. They mean somebody that the Romans nailed or tied to a cross in order to publicly humiliate and torture to death. That's what they mean. If Paul said that Jesus got crucified, what does he mean? He means the same thing. He doesn't mean that Jesus was killed in outer space by demonic powers circling the globe. He's referring to a death that the Romans inflicted on criminals. That's what everybody means in the first century. Second, if Jesus did not exist, let's just say, suppose he did not exist, then necessarily the Christians invented him. And so the big question, if the Christians invented Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, the Messiah, the Christ, would they invent the idea that as the Messiah, he got crucified? If you work hard enough at it, you might be able to imagine inventing a God who got killed and raised from the dead, as many mythicists say. But that's not what Paul talks about. Paul doesn't talk about God who was crucified. God was crucified for you. Paul talks about Christ who was crucified. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2. We do nothing among you except for Christ and him crucified. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and following. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and was buried. By the way, he was buried. It's a little hard to do in the outer space. Christ was crucified. Would somebody make up a Messiah, specifically the Messiah, who was crucified? It's important to understand what Jews meant. Paul was a Jew. It's important to understand what Jews meant by the term Christ. In the days of Paul, there were some Jews who were expecting that a Messiah was going to come to the Jewish people sent from God. God would send a Messiah. The word Messiah actually comes from a Hebrew word, Mashiach, which means anointed one. Messiah is the same word as the Greek word Christ. The Hebrew word is Messiah, Greek word Christ. I have to tell my students this because many of my students think that Jesus Christ is his last name. Jesus Christ, born to Joseph and Mary Christ. And it doesn't mean Jesus the Messiah. Jews had various expectations of what this Messiah would be, the anointed one. This is a term that's originally used in Jewish scriptures to refer to the king of Israel. He was the anointed one. When the king was anointed at his coronation ceremony, like King David, King Solomon, this showed that God was putting his favor upon him. In Jesus' day, there hadn't been a king on the throne for nearly 600 years. Some people thought there would be a king on the throne, and they called him the anointed one, the Messiah. The Messiah was going to be a great warrior figure like David, a great warrior who drove out the enemy and set up God's kingdom by establishing a throne in Jerusalem, and Israel would once more be a sovereign state that would rule over its enemies. That's what the Messiah would do. Some Jews thought that the Messiah would be a cosmic figure who would destroy the forces of evil and set up God's kingdom on earth, a mighty cosmic judge. There were various expectations of what the Messiah would be, but there was one thing that all of the expectations had in common. Jews who expected a Messiah expected a great, powerful figure who would destroy the enemy and set up God's kingdom. And who was Jesus? The Christians said that Jesus was a crucified criminal. If you wanted to make up a story about the Messiah, would you make up the story that the Messiah had been crucified? That's the opposite of what the Messiah is supposed to be. If you want to make up a story about a Messiah, you'd make up the story that, well, he actually drove out the Romans and he is sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. Why didn't they make up that story? Because it obviously wasn't true. The early Christians were not going around saying that God had been crucified. They were saying that Christ had been crucified. Well, why did they do that? If it didn't make any sense to expect a crucified Messiah. It was because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and they knew that he got crucified. You can't explain the crucified Messiah as something that was made up. The crucified Messiah is because people thought Jesus was the Messiah, and they knew that this man had been killed as a crucified criminal. That's why Paul says that the crucifixion of Jesus was the greatest stumbling block for Jews. It was the one reason most Jews rejected the Christian claim that Jesus was the Messiah. Most Jews thought the claim was crazy. It was absurd. The Messiah is crucified. Well, it's like a contradiction in terms. Of course he wasn't crucified. So why did Christians say it? They had no choice because they knew that the man Jesus had been crucified. Let me sum up. Jesus is one of the best attested Palestinian Jews of the first century. We have numerous sources that talk about him. These sources give us valuable information. The sources are problematic. They are historically difficult. Historians spend their lives trying to figure out what in them is historical and what is not. That does not mean that there's nothing historical in them. There is historical information in them. You have to find it. Included with the historical sources, though, are also the writings of the Apostle Paul. Paul, within 2 years of Jesus' life, absolutely knew that he was a historical figure, that he was a Jewish preacher and teacher who ended up on the wrong side of the law and was crucified by the Roman authorities. Let me end with a final word, something that I tell my students, my Christian students in North Carolina, but I think it would be appropriate here as well. That is that on this or any other topic, I hope you do not decide to believe only what's convenient. I have to tell my students this. Only what you want to believe or what you would like to be right. If you want to know if something is true, you should look at the evidence and then decide. If you decide that it's true, you should accept it and deal with it. It may change your broader perspective, or it may not. But in either case, you will at least be basing your perspective on what you have reason to believe to be true. Thank you very much.